When COVID-19 is finally behind us, and historians have had a chance to record the definitive version of what happened in that terrible year of 2020, there is one question that will likely remain unresolved. What was behind the great toilet paper panic? Of all the things that humanity requires to stay alive in these situations, surely food should rank above toilet paper. And for sure, there were incidences of hoarding, and some items became difficult to buy for a while. But overall, populations seemed reasonably confident that they would still have access to nutrition. But were they right to be so confident? Certainly in the rich countries, the supermarkets seemed to remain adequately stocked. But what about in the developing countries? Farmers, laborers, everybody in the supply chain for agriculture was being hit hard, with the movement of people being severely restricted. How could transient and migrant laborers even get to work? How would the producers of vegetables and foodstuffs be able to get their goods to market when the transport systems were being so hard hit? TechnoServe is a non-profit organization working to reduce poverty in developing nations by supporting farmers and entrepreneurs to develop sustainable businesses. Kindra Halverson is their Chief Transformation Officer, and she joined me for a chat about how COVID-19 had affected agricultural supply chains. Kindra, thanks very much indeed for talking to me today. Let's look at the big picture very quickly, if we might, because when COVID first started, we saw all those strange scenes of people rushing to the department stores and to the grocery stores and loading up. Initially on toilet paper, which I still don't understand why, but subsequently on foodstuffs. That sort of panic has died down a little bit. But I'm just wondering, should we be comfortable now that everything is okay? Or are there weaknesses in the system that have been exposed?
COVID-19 is having a huge impact on agriculture and the food system overall. From all the media that I've seen, there is no real concern about a global food shortage. The challenge is about getting the food from where it's produced to consumers where they now want to eat it. For consumers like you and me, that's likely to amount to nothing more than an inconvenience.
Where then are the weaknesses in the system apparent? What are the areas in the supply chain or the system overall that we should be concerned about?
My organization, TechnoServe, works with smallholder farmers in countries all over the world. And what we're seeing is that there is a real risk of a food crisis in many developing countries. And that's because the businesses and the smallholder farmers that operate in those countries are already operating on very low margins. They have little resources in the bank to allow them to respond to shocks when things like this arise. And that is the disruptions to the supply chain are making it very difficult for farmers to get their produce to market, for processors to have workers at their plants and operating safely, and then to get that food to consumers through the small shops and retailers that bring food that last mile.
So it is a pronounced problem in the developing countries rather than the developed. I mean, not only presumably because of so much more manpower being put to the chores of planting and harvesting and delivering than perhaps in a more mechanized system. But should we worry about the fact that their livelihoods are being disrupted or that they can't get hold of food for themselves?
The access to food is a danger for urban consumers in particular and peri-urban consumers. In the short run, it's less of a risk for smallholder farmers. They are having trouble already getting access to some of the processed nutritious foods that make up part of their diet. But the bigger short-term risk to smallholder farmers is really about income. In countries like India, we are already seeing farmers lose a significant portion of their income, and we expect the agriculture sector to contract pretty significantly. Smallholder farmers could lose as much as a third of their income this year.
We've seen a lot of comment about how this might affect the war against poverty in general, in India, in Africa, in Asia. I saw one headline which seemed extremely pessimistic, saying the war against poverty has been set back 30 years. I don't know if you agree that it's that bad, but do you think it's that serious? And how quickly do you think we're able to recover from it?
It could be that serious in some places, but I do think that there are still opportunities to mitigate the worst of those threats. How quickly we're able to recover depends very much on the actions that we take now.
Tell me a bit what kind of actions you think. I mean, intervention is possible. We've seen it in various circumstances. Where do you think intervention should happen and who should be doing it?
We would love to see a coordinated response among donors and governments, really starting with the businesses that are operating at the center of our agricultural supply chains. These are really the linchpin businesses that connect producers with consumers, and we need to keep them operational. In the short run, they need access to finance, whether that's grants or concessionary loans that simply help them stay operational, help them keep paying laborers, help them keep buying produce from smallholder farmers and getting that to market. But any intervention does have to take into consideration the system as a whole and how these pieces are connected.
Again, you're talking about smallholder farmers and supply chains, presumably within developing market contexts, right? The supply chain and the producer linchpins that you're talking about within the really big multinational operations is not quite the same thing.
They are also struggling, but typically they have more resources to adapt and respond to these types of shocks in the system. But certainly, I think as we look to the future, we'll see even big multinational companies be thinking much more seriously about resilience in their supply chains, having a diversified supply base, building in technology and systems that allow them to stay in touch with and communicate with their suppliers over distance and over time with less face-to-face interaction.
You said a moment ago in answer to the question about intervention, you said we would like to see, which implies that you're not seeing what you would like to see as yet. Do you think the reaction and the intervention and the responses from governments and those in charge has been adequate? And are you seeing it getting to a place where you think it should get?
It's a mixed bag as you look across the world, certainly. There is more and more attention to the economic impact of the crisis. Understandably, I think governments and international donors have been focused on the health crisis as a starting point. But we need to be attending to the potential economic crisis relatively quickly in order to mitigate the biggest risks. We're starting to see that, but we need to see a lot more coordination and attention, especially to the risk of food crisis where that is possible.
A lot of the work that you do involves, trying to bring technologies and processes and workflows to these developing countries that will help to improve their situation and their efficiency. Tell me a little bit about some of the products and projects and ideas that you've seen deployed that can really help in this situation.
So technology is helping us respond to the COVID crisis in a significant way. I think we're seeing a massive acceleration of many types of technologies. And what we're most excited about are technologies that support remote learning and technical advice, and also remote imaging and sensing, like satellites and drones that help us to understand what's happening where produce is being grown.
Give me a couple of examples. Let's start with remote learning. Do you mean sort of education or just use of technology?
Well, both. I mean, education, but also extension support for farmers. We have TechnoServe has an initiative called TechnoServe Labs, and we focus on the adaptation and use of technology for bottom of the pyramid consumers around the world. What we see as having a lot of potential are the sort of text messaging and chat interfaces that allow smallholder farmers or small business owners to ask the questions and get the solutions that they need to the problems that are right in front of them. We are anticipating a trend toward this type of technology and away from apps that can take time and cost money to download and figure out. And so we're experimenting with that. We're running a number of pilots in Africa using that type of technology and understanding what's most useful and how it's most useful. At the end of the day, it's not going to be the newest and most exciting technology that wins, but the technology that meets the needs of people where they are.
And these are easily deployable technologies. They're not going to rely on a big infrastructure backbone or some fancy new technologies that will be hard to pass on.
Well, certainly with remote learning, we're really focused on technologies that are already in heavy use, Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp, and things that are widely used in the developing world already. And how can we get that use adapted to deploy educational tools and resources in a way that people can access it on their phones or through other technologies that they have access to.
And what about the imaging that you talked of?
That's obviously a bit more complex. And requires a more piloting. We're doing some testing of that, especially with cashew production in West Africa. But the potential for that to reduce the cost of working with smallholder farmers, both for businesses and for development organizations like TechnoServe, is huge. If we can understand which farmers are close to harvest, a business then knows when to go and pick up that product. If we can understand what exact production problems a particular farmer is having, we know how to intervene and support her with information that's going to help her address that. The challenge with smallholder farming is the number of smallholder farmers and the disbursement. They're so fragmented. It's difficult to reach them with services, and it's difficult to use them as a supplier base. And imaging technology, while it has further to go before it's widely applicable and useful, has tremendous potential to help that.
You talked about using existing technologies and nothing, cutting edge or really complex. But to what extent is there a trade-off here between deploying the stuff that works and trying to deploy stuff that may be slightly newer and harder to understand, but helps to skip a generation that really will be in place for years and decades to come, rather than just being appropriate to now?
That's a great question. I think that we will sometimes see technology use leapfrog in developing markets, much as we have with digital phones and mobile money. That didn't start in certainly in the US. But the solutions have to be low cost. They have to be easy to use. And it's atypical that the newest technologies are really able to tick both of those boxes. But certainly we need initiatives like TechnoServe Labs and others that are scanning the horizon for technologies that are coming out and piloting and testing those and continuously learning. And when we see potential for something to transform smallholder agriculture, we want to scale that effect.
The situation we're facing right now is sort of slightly obscuring the fact that there was a growing problem anyway, wasn't it? By which, of course, I mean the climate change issue that everyone has been trying to prepare for. Do you think that COVID has helped or hindered the attempts to make farming, smallholder farmers, developing countries more resilient to the problems of climate change?
In the short term, COVID-19 impact on climate change adaptation is definitely going to be negative. I mean, people's attention to that will be diverted elsewhere. I think in the long run, it actually will help us with climate change adaptation. The threat of these types of shocks is much more apparent to all of us now. It feels much more immediate. The sense that we have to invest for resilience, I think, is much more prominent in governments, in industry, and even I think smallholder farmers always feel that because they're always on the edge. But I think in the medium term, it's going to lead to a lot more investment and resilience to climate shocks and climate change.
Can you be a bit more specific? I mean, are you seeing a positive because it opens up minds and focuses attention where it should be focused? Or are you seeing specific physical realities that you think are now or will soon be addressed as a consequence?
I think COVID will affect our orientation towards climate change resilience because it will focus our minds on the need for resilience and the lack of resilience in the system.
On a slightly different but related note, I mean, are you seeing any changes in consumption or production patterns as a consequence of either or climate change and COVID going on? Long-term trends that you think are worth noting at this point?
It's early days to understand how COVID is going to impact long-term consumption trends. And certainly, people are consuming at home rather than in restaurants and hotels. And lots of pundits are anticipating that that trend will continue, certainly for the next year or two until there's some kind of COVID vaccine. I think we'll see that consumption pattern persist. Climate change, I think, also is starting to affect what people are eating and an orientation toward more plant-based foods. And I expect that's a trend that will continue as well.
Do you think there's a movement towards more locally produced foods? I mean, supply chains that span the globe are something that a lot of people are raising question marks about.
I do think that we'll see an orientation toward more locally produced foods. We've been starting to hear about that because of the threat of climate change and the carbon footprint that arises from moving food all over the globe. But the threat that people are feeling as a result of the coronavirus and disruptions to the supply chains have a lot to do with the extent to which they depend on food that comes from other countries. And when we talk about resilience, I think many countries will be thinking about how to ensure their own local food resilience in the future and reduce their dependence on imports so that they're not faced with some of the same challenges that they're encountering right now.
And finally, let's look at the policy level response. We saw here in Asia, Vietnam was beginning to put some blocks on the export of rice. Do you think in the longer term, governments are going to be reconsidering how they put their policies in place and how they govern and regulate their supply chains and their farmers and their communities?
Governments have often been inclined to put export bans and import bans onto commodities that are important for food supply, whether that's for political reasons or in cases like this where they're trying to protect the food security of their country. I hope that as we go forward, the focus will be on stability. What really most negatively affects businesses and smallholder farmers is unpredictable policy on these fronts, because then they can't make good decisions about what to produce or how much to produce because they don't know what the prices are going to be or what markets are going to be open to them. So if I were to hope for any trend in government policy around food commodities, it would be predictability and stability.
Let's hope that happens. Kyndra, thanks very much indeed for talking to me.
Thank you.